unreeled. Vintage recordings of fiction recovered from discontinued physical media.
Heidi. One sunny morning in June, a young Swiss woman was climbing a shady path that turned sharply upwards into the rugged Alps. She was leading a little girl by the hand. In spite of the sun, the child was wearing 2 thick dresses, heavy mountain shoes, and a big red shawl. After an hour's hard climbing, they came to Dorfli, a tiny village halfway up the mountain pasture, called the Alm. But they didn't pause until a voice from a doorway called out,
"Data, where are you taking the child?"
Data stopped.
"Isn't that your sister's little girl, the orphan?"
"Yes," replied Data. "I'm taking her up to live with the Alm uncle. I've cared for Heidi ever since her parents died. Now it's her grandfather's turn."
"But he's so fierce," said the friend, "with those great bushy eyebrows and that tangled beard. And they say he has a very wicked past. How can you have the heart to leave the poor child with him?"
"I have to," replied Data curtly. "I have a job to go to in Frankfurt." She looked around for Heidi, but she had disappeared. While they'd been chatting, Heidi had caught sight of Peter, the goatherd, and climbed on up to join him and the goats. Every morning Peter collected goats from the village and drove them up to the Alm, where they grazed until evening. Seeing him barefoot, Heidi had removed her shoes, her shawl, and her dresses, so that she was just in her petticoat. Now she, too, was free to jump and skip with the goats.
"Heidi, where are your clothes?"
cried Data angrily when at last she found them. "I didn't need them," Heidi replied simply.
"Indeed? Well, you, Peter, must fetch them and take them up to the Alm uncle's, since you're going that way."
Swiftly he did so, and was rewarded with a coin, which pleased him a good deal. After 3/4 of an hour more climbing, this little group arrived at the Alm uncle's cottage. There he now sat, on a bench overlooking the valley, puffing away on his pipe. Heidi was the first to reach him, and steadily she held out her hand. "Good evening, grandfather," she said. "What's the meaning of this?" asked the old man gruffly. He took her hand, and beneath his bushy eyebrows regarded her sharply. Heidi returned his look without blinking. Data now came forward. "Good day, uncle," she said breezily. "This is your grandchild. You haven't seen her since she was a year old."
"So? What have I to do with her?" he asked.
"She just has to stay with you. I have to make my own living now, and you are the child's nearest relative. You must answer for any harm that comes to her. Goodbye, Heidi." And so saying, she turned and fled down the mountain as fast as she could go. A while later, after Data had left and Peter had carried on up the Alm, Heidi began to inspect her new home. First she peeped into the goat house, then to the other side of the cottage, where 3 ancient fir trees stood swaying slightly. She listened for a while to the moaning of the wind, then returned to the grandfather, who sat in silence on his bench. "I should like to see inside, please."
"Come along then, and bring your bundle of clothes."
"I don't need them any more. I'd rather be like the goats. They don't have lots of clothes to bother them." The old man turned and stared at her. Then he smiled.
"Well, do as you please, but we'll keep them in a cupboard just in case."
Inside the cottage was a big room with a table and chair, a fireplace above which hung a big black kettle, and in one corner Grandfather's bed.
"Where shall I sleep, Grandfather?"
Heidi asked. "Wherever you want to," he replied. Heidi inspected every corner of the cottage. She found a little ladder leading to a sweet-smelling hayloft, and from a round window in the roof she could see far down into the valley. This was perfect.
"Oh, this is where I want to sleep. It's lovely," she cried.
And so with a sheet, some sacking, and bundles of fresh hay, the two of them made up her new bed. She could hardly wait for night time so that she could go to sleep on it. But now it was lunch time. In the room below, Grandfather put a big piece of cheese on a toasting fork and turned it to and fro over the fire till it was golden brown all over. Heidi watched him for a while, then darted away to the cupboard and brought out knives and plates and bowls, which she carefully laid on the table. "Good," said the old man approvingly. "So you can think for yourself, eh? But now, where are you going to sit?" There was only one chair, but Heidi quickly spied a three-legged stool by the hearth, and she sat on that. She ate hungrily the delicious cheese and bread he gave her, and washed it all down with a bowl of goat's milk.
"It's the best milk I've ever tasted," she declared, and promptly drank another bowlful. When the meal was over, Grandfather had chores to do. First he swept out the goat house and put fresh straw down, Heidi watching him attentively. Then to his shed, where he spent some time sawing and chopping pieces of wood. At last, after much drilling and hammering, he produced a chair, just like his, only higher. Heidi knew it was for her because it was so high, and she was speechless with admiration. Evening came, and Peter arrived surrounded by frolicking goats. Two pretty, slender little goats ran towards the grandfather, who held out some salt on his hand for them to lick. "The white one is Little Swan, and the brown one is Little Bear," Grandfather told Heidi, and once Peter had taken the rest of the herd down to Dorfley, Grandfather began to milk Little Swan. "Do they really belong to us, Grandfather? Do they sleep in the little shed? Do they always stay with us?"
Heidi was filled with delight at the prospect.
"Yes, yes," Grandfather said. "Now go and fetch your bowl so that you can have your supper. I have to tie the goats up for the night now."
Heidi sat on the bench outside with her supper, listening to the wind in the trees, then went inside and climbed the small ladder to her hayloft. Before she knew it, she was fast asleep, and when Grandfather came to see if the strong wind had wakened her, she looked as cozy as if she were in the best feather bed. The early morning sunshine woke Heidi, and for a minute she lay wondering where she was. As the exciting events of the previous day came flooding back to her, she heard a loud whistle. It was Peter and the goats. In a trice she was dressed and down the steps to greet them.
"How would you like to go up to the pasture with the Goat General?"
asked the grandfather, as he led Little Swan and Little Bear to join the others. This was exactly what Heidi had hoped she could do, so after a few preparations and instructions from the Elm Uncle, Peter and Heidi were happily climbing their way up the elm. Heidi jumped and pranced up the slopes just like the goats, so that Peter could hardly keep pace with her. The grassy mountainside was covered with the most glorious alpine flowers, and the combination of their scent with the blue sky and golden sunlight filled her with pure delight. She felt she had never been so happy. When they reached the pasture, they stopped to rest. Peter took out from his rucksack the lunch of bread and cheese that the grandfather had prepared for Heidi. Then he milked Little Swan so she could have her bowl of milk. Peter himself only had a meagre lunch, and when Heidi realized that,
she gave him half of hers. He couldn't believe his good fortune, and ate it hungrily. Suddenly he jumped up and raced towards the goats who were grazing among the bushes. Heidi followed him and watched as he flung himself to the ground and seized a tiny goat by the leg. It was Goldfinch. She had strayed too near the edge of the precipice and was in danger of falling off. "Heidi! Heidi, help!" Peter shouted, scared that Goldfinch's leg would break. Seeing the danger, Heidi quickly gathered some sweet-smelling plants and held them out to her. "Come on, Goldfinch, there's a good girl," she called gently. The goats stopped struggling and followed Heidi, nibbling at the herbs, until they were well away from the dangerous edge. Peter got up, and raising his stick, started to beat the poor frightened animal. "No, Peter, no!" cried Heidi. "You mustn't beat her! I won't let you!" Peter stopped in surprise at the fierce little girl. "All right," he said. "If you give me some more cheese again tomorrow." "You can have it all every day, if you promise not to beat any of them again." And so, with that bargain made, they passed the rest of the afternoon contentedly, till gradually the sun began to sink beyond the snow-capped mountain tops. Heidi sat on the grass watching the golden light slide over the green slopes. Then suddenly she cried out, "Peter, look at the fiery snow! All the mountains are burning! Everything is on fire!" "Oh, it's always like that, but it isn't real fire," Peter said with great unconcern. "What is it then?" "I dunno. It just gets like that every day. Come on, we must go home." Heidi was so full of thoughts as they descended the mountain, she was silent until they reached the Alm uncle's hut. The moment Peter had left, she described to Grandfather all the wonderful things she'd seen, and finally asked him about the fire on the mountains. "Well," began Grandfather thoughtfully, "that's what the sun does when he says good night to the mountains. He throws his most beautiful rays over them, so they won't forget him before morning." Day after day Heidi went up to the high pasture with Peter and the goats. She delighted in everything she saw and heard, from the cry of the huge golden eagle as it flew to its far-off nest, to the tiniest wild alpine flower. As the summer passed, she became as brown as a berry in the warm sun, but soon autumn came, and Grandfather wouldn't let her go in case the wind blew her down the mountainside. And one day they awoke to find the whole Alm covered in snow. Winter had arrived. Peter could no longer herd the goats, and instead had to go to school in the village. Heidi was now glad of the warm clothes she'd kept in a bundle in the cupboard. A visit was arranged to Peter's grandmother. She lived with him and his mother in a tiny cottage halfway between the village and the Alm, and Heidi was thrilled to learn that the only way to get there in the snow was by sledge. They shot down the Alm so fast Heidi felt she was flying through the air. Grandfather set her down outside the hut, instructing her to return at dusk, and climbed back up the slope. Inside the dark cottage, a woman was sitting at a table sewing, and in a corner a much older woman sat spinning. Heidi went straight up to her and said, "Good day, Grandmother. Here I am to see you." The old lady groped for Heidi's hand and said, "Is it really Heidi, the child who lives with the Alm uncle?" "Yes, Mother," said Brigitta, and began describing her. "She's slender and small like her poor mother, and has black eyes and curly hair like her father." Meanwhile, Heidi was taking in everything around her. The hut was very dilapidated. "Look, Grandmother!" she exclaimed, pointing to a window. "That shutter's loose. My grandfather could fix it with a nail so it wouldn't rattle so." "Ah, my dear child, I cannot see it. but I can hear it. Sometimes I fear the whole house will fall to pieces in the wind."
Heidi was puzzled. "But why can't you see how the shutter swings?"
"Alas, child," said the grandmother, "I am blind."
Heidi covered her face with her hands and wept. How could anything be so dreadful as to live in utter darkness when there were so many beautiful things to see? At length she dried her eyes and said,
"I know. Grandfather will make it light for you again, and repair the cottage. He can do anything."
Thus cheered by her plan, she began to tell the old woman all about her new life on the elm. Soon Peter returned from school and beamed when he saw Heidi. But the light was fading, and Heidi knew she had to start her climb home, so, promising to return as soon as possible, she said her goodbyes and left. Grandfather had come down most of the way to meet her, and lifting her up, he wrapped her in a blanket and carried her back home, her muffled voice chatting to him all the time. To the grandmother's delight, they returned the very next afternoon. This time the old man stayed and nailed up all the loose boards, mended the broken shutters, and even began to repair the roof. Brigitta and her mother could hardly believe it. They had never known the elm uncle to be so helpful. Now, every fine winter's afternoon, they would toboggan down to the cottage, the grandfather to do repairs, and Heidi to talk to the grandmother. After so many dark and lonely years, the grandmother now had Heidi's visits to look forward to, and though not even the grandfather could restore her sight, a great happiness had entered her life in the shape of Heidi. The seasons came and went, and Heidi was as happy as a bird. Now she was 8 years old, and the time had come for her to go to school. The pastor from Dorfli called to try and encourage the elm uncle to move down to the village for the bitter winter months. But to no avail. He wouldn't hear of it. "She must grow up with the goats and birds. That way she will learn nothing evil," he said fiercely. That same afternoon another visitor called. It was Data. "Heidi, my dear, how well you look!" she exclaimed. "I've come to give you some wonderful news." And she proceeded to tell them about a rich family in Frankfurt called Sesemann, whose invalid daughter Clara needed a companion. "I thought of you immediately, Heidi. Isn't it marvelous news?" The grandfather glared furiously at her. "Then take it elsewhere. We'll hear no more of it." But Data wasn't easily put off. "If you refuse to send the child to school, the law will be on my side, and if I am forced to bring in the law, things could be brought up against you which I am sure you wouldn't like to hear." Slowly Grandfather rose from his chair. White with rage, he said, "Very well. Take her, ruin her, and never let me set eyes on you again." He turned and strode out of the hut.
"You've made him angry," cried Heidi. "I won't come with you."
"Don't be stubborn, Heidi," said Data, gathering the bundle of clothes wrapped in the big red shawl. "You've no idea how lovely Frankfurt is, and if you don't like it, well, you can come back here again."
"Tonight?"
"Don't be silly, dear. I said any time you want to." And she grasped Heidi firmly by the hand and began the long climb down the mountain. When they came to Peter's house, Heidi exclaimed,
"Oh, I must say goodbye to the grandmother."
But Data held her even more tightly and said, "Not now, Heidi. You can see her when you come back. You could bring her some nice present." This idea appealed to the child.
"What could I bring her?"
"Oh, perhaps some nice soft white rolls. She'd like that."
"Oh, yes. The black bread is too hard for her to eat. Oh, let's hurry. The sooner we get to Frankfurt, the sooner I'll be back with the rolls.
In the study of the Seseman's large house, an invalid girl was sitting in her wheelchair watching the clock.
Isn't it time yet, Fräulein Rottenmeier?
The housekeeper nodded. Since the death of Clara's mother, this formidable lady had taken charge of the Sesemann household, except for the rare occasions when Clara's father was home from his many business trips abroad. At last the doorbell rang, and Heidi and Data were shown into the study by Tinette the maid. Fräulein Rottenmeier stared in disbelief at the forlorn figure in her simple cotton dress and battered straw hat. "How old is this child?" she asked Data. "I did stress that Fräulein Clara's companion had to be able to share her lessons with her."
I am 8, said Heidi clearly. Grandfather told me.
"What? But Fräulein Clara is 12. Well, and what books have you read then?"
None. I can't read, Heidi said.
Fräulein Rottenmeier turned on Data. "How dare you bring this child to me? This was not the agreement at all." But Data was not easily frightened. "I thought Heidi would suit you. She may be younger than you expected, but older children can be disobedient. Now I must go. My mistress is waiting for me." And she swept out of the room, the outraged housekeeper hurrying after her. Clara beckoned Heidi over to her.
Heidi's short for Adelheid, isn't it? Which do you prefer to be called? I've always been called Heidi, she replied. Then I shall always call you that too. Oh, what fun it will be with you here. I can listen to you learning to read. The tutor's very kind, but so dull.
They were interrupted by the announcement of dinner, and Sebastian, the butler, wheeled Clara into the dining room. By the side of Heidi's place at the table was a lovely white bread roll. Her eyes lit up, and when the butler came to offer her some fish, she pointed to the roll and said,
"May I have that?"
Sebastian, trying to suppress a broad grin, nodded. Heidi seized the roll and put it in her pocket.
"I'll have some fish now, please."
When Sebastian had left the room, Fräulein Rottenmeier turned to Heidi with a stern face. "You must learn some good behavior, Adelheid. Firstly, do not speak to the butler unless it is absolutely necessary, nor to Tinette the maid, and address me as Fräulein Rottenmeier." And she continued with a long list of household rules about punctuality and tidiness, etc. Meanwhile, to Clara's amusement, Heidi had fallen fast asleep, the long journey having tired her out, and she had to be carried up to bed. From the moment she woke up next morning, Heidi felt imprisoned. The high windows only looked out over streets and houses, and when she thought she heard fir trees rustling in the breeze, it turned out to be carriage wheels rumbling down the street. She asked Sebastian how she could get a view of the whole valley. "You could climb the church steeple," he told her. "From there you can see for miles." So, on her first free afternoon, while Clara was resting, Heidi set out to find the church tower. She asked directions from a boy with a barrel organ and a curious pet on his arm. He offered to take her there and back for 4d, a sum Heidi didn't possess, but she told him with confidence,
"Oh, it's all right. Clara will pay you."
The view from the tower was very disappointing, all rooftops and chimneys. When she came down again, the churchwarden tried to cheer her up by showing her a basket of kittens. "Would you like to have one?" Heidi's face lit up.
"Oh, yes, please. Could I have one for Clara, too?"
And so off she went, with a tiny kitten in each pocket. Back home, Fräulein Rottenmeier was waiting for her with a stony face. "You're late. Where have you been, Adelheid?" came the answer. "How dare you be so rude?"
"It's not me," said Heidi. "It's the kittens."
Fräulein Rottenmeier nearly exploded. She hated animals. "Take them away! Get rid of them!" And she rushed into the study, locking the door after her. Sebastian, who had greatly enjoyed this episode, found the kittens a home in the attic, where the children could play with them at their leisure. The next day, the barrel organ player arrived on the Sesamans' doorstep. "I've come to get my fourpence off someone called Clara," he told Sebastian, who suspected more mischief, but nevertheless showed him into the study where the girls were at lessons. After a few moments, sounds of gay organ music were wafting around the house, eventually reaching Fräulein Rottenmeier's ears. With mounting anger, she marched to the study, and there, incredible though it seemed, were Heidi and Clara gazing happily at a ragged boy playing a barrel organ. If that wasn't bad enough, his curious pet, a tortoise, was crawling over the floor, causing Fräulein Rottenmeier to leap into the air, shrieking, "Sebastian, take it away! Take it away!" Events like these caused the lady to build up an even greater resentment against poor Heidi. Worse still, she'd discovered Heidi's secret hoard of bread rolls, which Heidi had been saving for the grandmother, and was convinced that Heidi wasn't right in the head. She said as much to Herr Sesemann when he next returned home from abroad, and told him of the disorder Heidi created in the household. "Well, first I think I should discuss the matter with my daughter," he said, and when he was alone with Clara, asked for her opinion. She told him everything, about the tortoise and the kittens and trying to see the view, and pleaded with him not to send her away.
"The time has passed so quickly since Heidi came. Please don't let her go."
Later that evening, Clara's father had stern words with Fräulein Rottenmeier, saying that he found Heidi perfectly normal and that she must be treated with kindness and understanding. Papa's stay in Frankfurt was a short one, but 2 days after he left, there was more excitement at the arrival of Clara's grandmamma. This gentle, kind old lady took to Heidi immediately. She helped her learn to sew, and gave her books to look at with beautiful pictures. Heidi was so thrilled with one book in particular that she began learning to read at once, so that by the time Frau Sesamann's visit was over, Heidi was able to read aloud to Clara every evening. But Heidi grew sadder and sadder. Nothing could take the place of life on the Alm, and she became more homesick as each day passed. She had long ago realized that Data had deceived her, that she just couldn't go home whenever she liked, and anyway she couldn't bear to hurt those people who'd shown her so much kindness. But she was losing her appetite, and at night she would lie awake for hours imagining the Alm in the crimson sunshine, and wondering if Little Swan and Little Bear missed her, and praying that Peter wasn't beating Goldfinch, and then she would bury her head in the pillow and cry herself to sleep. About this time a strange thing was happening in the Sesamon household. Every morning the front door was found wide open, though it had been locked and bolted the night before. Clara's father was called back to try and solve the mystery. So one night he and a doctor friend stayed up to see what happened. Just after 1 o'clock they heard the key in the lock and the bolts being drawn. They crept into the hall, and there stood a tiny white figure, motionless in the moonlight, staring out through the open door. As the men approached, the figure turned and gave a little cry. In her white nightgown, with bare feet, Heidi stood shivering and blinking in fear. The doctor gently lifted her and carried her back to bed. Tenderly he tucked her up, then sat on the edge of the bed, holding her hand. "It's all right now," he said. "Tell me where you wanted to go."
"I didn't want to go anywhere," she sobbed. "I just got there somehow. I dreamt I was on the Alm with Grandfather, and I can hear the fir trees rustling, and I run to the door to look out at the stars. But when I wake up, I'm still here."
And she dissolved into tears that shook her little body from head to toe. When they'd subsided, the doctor rose and said, "Sleep now. Tomorrow everything will be all right." He went downstairs and spoke to Herr Sesemann. "This child has been sleepwalking. She is pining away with homesickness. She must go home tomorrow." Clara's father was horrified, but realizing the gravity of the situation, began to make arrangements for Heidi's departure there and then, so that by breakfast time preparations were well under way. "Well, Heidi, and how do you feel about going home today?" asked Herr Sesemann at breakfast.
"Home?"
Heidi echoed faintly. So the kind doctor had meant what he said. Her face glowed with pleasure. Poor Clara was not so happy at the news. She had grown to love her little companion dearly, but her father contented her with the promise of a visit to Switzerland the following year. She packed a big trunk full of clothes and provisions for Heidi to take back with her, and gave her a basket with 12 fresh white rolls for Peter's grandmother. Heidi was brimming with excitement, and it wasn't long before she was sitting in the carriage, accompanied by Sebastian, on the start of her long journey back to the elm. Heidi's heart was pounding as she stepped out of the cart which had carried her up from Mayenfeld to Dorfli. She arranged for her trunk to be collected the next day, then began the familiar climb up the mountain path. As she approached Peter's cottage, she was trembling with fear lest anything might have happened to the frail grandmother during her absence. But when she lifted the latch and ran inside, there sat the old lady in her usual corner at the spinning wheel. "Oh, that's the way Heidi used to run in. Who's there?" she called.
"But it is Heidi, grandmother."
And she rushed to her, flinging her arms round her and hugging her. "Is it really you?" she said, stroking Heidi's curly hair.
"Yes, and look what I've brought you from Frankfurt."
She took out the rolls from her basket and laid them one by one on the old lady's lap. "What blessings you bring, child," she said, feeling each roll. "But the greatest blessing is yourself." Now Heidi set out up the mountain once more. The sun was just beginning to sink behind the snowfields, and Heidi paused for a moment, drinking in the beauty of the crimson mountain tops. She found that tears of thankfulness were trickling down her cheeks. Then she ran as fast as she could, until at last the fir trees and grandfather's hut came into view. And there he sat, on his bench, smoking his pipe, staring out over the valley. Heidi dropped her basket and ran to embrace him, unable to say anything more than
"Grandfather, grandfather,"
over and over. He couldn't speak, and as they held each other, his eyes filled with tears. Then suddenly came the shrill whistle. Peter had arrived on his way down to the village, and Heidi rushed to meet her old friend. As the goats rubbed their heads eagerly against her, Peter just stared, not believing his eyes. Then a smile spread over his face. "Will you come up to the pasture tomorrow?" he asked, just as in the old days. Then shyly, "I am glad you're back." And off he went, cheerfully urging the goats down the mountainside. Soon the whole of Dorfli knew of Heidi's return, and the villagers were amazed to think that she'd given up a luxurious home to come back to living in a hut on the Alm, especially with a man as ferocious as the Alm uncle. They were even more amazed when one day he and Heidi were seen to enter the village church.
"Look, the Alm uncle! Did you see the Alm uncle?"
was being whispered all round Dorfli, for he'd never been known to go to church before. Afterwards, Grandfather called on the pastor, who greeted him warmly. "Pastor, I see now that I was wrong," said the grandfather. "I am going to follow your advice and take a house in Dorfley for the winter months." The pastor was delighted. "My dear friend," he said, "you will never have cause to regret this decision. I look forward to many a long winter's evening in your company, and Heidi will find plenty of friends among us." So, by the time the snows fell and covered the elm once more, Heidi and her grandfather were settled into their new winter home, a rambling old house that had needed much repair. Little Swan installed in part of the house for their winter quarters too. The whole plan delighted Heidi. When at last she started school, she found it very new and exciting, and learnt very quickly. Of course she could read already, and had long been reading hymns and stories to Peter's grandmother during the warmer months. Now that she was down in the village, Peter would have to take her place. But he was such a slow learner, and was constantly playing truant from school. Heidi decided to teach him to read, as he wasn't making much progress at school, and with the help of some little rhymes she made up, taught him the alphabet. Within a few weeks he was amazing teachers and family alike with his new talent. Grandmother was delighted, and thought it nothing less than a miracle. One day, towards the end of the long winter, a letter came for Heidi from Frankfurt. It was from Clara, asking if she and Grandmamma could come and visit in the spring. She had missed Heidi dreadfully, and the doctor had said the air would do her good. Heidi was thrilled at the idea, so when she and Grandfather returned to the elm once the snow had melted, preparations for the visit began. Grandfather made 2 beautiful new chairs, and the hut was dusted and polished till everything shone. Not everyone was so delighted, however. Peter was cross at the thought of having to share Heidi with someone else, and the blind grandmother was scared that these city people might take her precious friend away again. Nevertheless, one beautiful warm spring morning, a curious procession could be seen toiling up the mountain path. 2 men in front carried a sedan chair in which sat Clara swathed in blankets. Then Grandmamma on horseback, looking around her keenly, and lastly a man pushing the empty wheelchair. "They're here! They're here!" cried Heidi joyfully, leaping up and down with excitement. When they finally got to the cottage, Heidi and Clara embraced each other lovingly. Grandmamma and the elm uncle felt like old friends, they'd heard so much about each other, and shook hands warmly. Clara was quite entranced by everything she saw. It was all just as Heidi had described to her all those months ago. The fir trees swaying, the sweet scent of the alpine flowers, the magnificent view down the valley. "Oh, if only I could go up to the high pasture with you too. I should like to climb all over the elm," said Clara. At lunchtime they all sat round the table in the open air, and ate with relish the delicious toasted cheese that Grandfather cooked so well. When the time came for their descent back to Dorfley later on that afternoon, Clara pleaded to be allowed to stay a bit longer.
"Let's just stay another hour, Grandmamma. We haven't seen inside the cottage yet."
Needing no prompting, Grandfather invited her to stay up there in the cottage with them for a few weeks, and seeing how Clara glowed with happiness at the prospect, and how protective and attentive the elm uncle was with her, Grandmamma agreed. The children's joy knew no bounds, and they shouted with delight.
"Oh, Grandfather, thank you, thank you!"
That night, lying in her new soft bed in the loft with Heidi, Clara stared out through the round window at the stars, and said, "Oh, Heidi, it seems as if we're riding through the sky." Long after Heidi had fallen asleep, Clara still gazed at the sparkling night sky. It was the first time she'd ever seen the stars. And so a new life opened up for the invalid girl, as she discovered new sights and sounds, tastes and smells. It was as if she was only now coming alive. She looked forward to every meal, Whereas before all food had tasted like cod liver oil, now she could hardly wait for her 2 bowls of milk and new baked bread and cheese. Each day she gained a little more colour and strength, and one evening Grandfather persuaded her to try and stand. She cried out in pain the first time and clung to him, but after that she tried it a bit longer every time. Meanwhile, Peter was feeling thoroughly disgruntled. Heidi seemed to pay him no attention whatsoever these days, her time being completely taken up with the invalid. One morning, as he lumbered despondently up the hillside with the goats, he caught sight of Clara's wheelchair standing outside the cottage. Although he'd seen it plenty of times before, it seemed then to be his greatest enemy, and rage and jealousy welled up inside him. Suddenly he rushed at it, and pushing with all his might, flung it down the mountainside. "Now she'll have to go back to Frankfurt!" he cried. He watched it turn over and break into 1,000 pieces. He laughed to think that once more he'd have Heidi to himself. Poor Peter! How was he to know that instead of doing Clara harm, he'd helped to bring a new meaning to her life, and that the only person to suffer would be himself? In the next few weeks he was tormented by a guilty conscience that pricked at him night and day. He was sure the police would come and take him to prison, and finally the strain became too much to bear, and he confessed his crime. That was all in the future, however. Now the disappearance of the wheelchair was blamed on a freak gust of wind that had blown it over the edge. At first the children were upset by the loss, but Clara realized that if she really wanted to see all over the elm, she would have to try harder to ignore the pain and learn to walk. So, with great perseverance, and of course support from Heidi and Grandfather, she gradually found she was able to put one foot in front of the other until she could actually take a few steps. Each day the pain eased a little more, and a slightly longer walk would be attempted. The girls had been writing regularly to Clara's grandmamma down in the village, and in their next letter they eagerly invited her up for a visit, without giving away their new secret. The day of the visit came, and Grandfather and the children sat excitedly on the bench outside, watching her arrival. She beamed as she approached at the sight of Clara's rosy cheeks, but before she could get too close, Heidi had helped Clara to her feet, and the two of them walked slowly towards her. The old lady stood transfixed for a moment. Then she embraced first one, then the other, then clasped the elm uncle's hand, speechless with pleasure and amazement. When she'd recovered from the shock, her first thought was to send for Clara's father to witness this miracle, and a telegram was duly dispatched to Paris. By some strange quirk of fate, however, Herr Sesemann was already there on the mountainside, climbing the path from Dorfli. He had left his work in Paris without any warning on a sudden impulse to see his daughter, from whom he had been separated all summer. But when he arrived at the hut on the elm, he didn't recognize the tall, fair-haired girl leaning on her smaller companion. Clara smiled and called, "Papa, don't you know me? Have I changed so much?" As they embraced one another, he said, "I had planned to surprise you, my dear, but this is the greatest surprise in all the world." Heidi held her grandfather's hand as they watched this happiest of family reunions. Now at last her friends would understand how dearly she loved her life on the elm, and why she had needed so badly to come home. Home to the sunlight, the scent of flowers, the sharp crystal air, the wind in the pine trees, and the people she knew and loved so well. She thought her heart would burst with happiness that day on the elm, and knew that never again would she have to leave her beloved mountains.